You feel it before you name it, a quiet easing that arrives without announcement, not relief, not resolution, just the sense that something inside you has stopped bracing. The moment did not need preparation. It did not require effort. It simply met you where you already were, as if the system recognized your stillness and adjusted itself around you. There is no urgency here. Whatever brought your attention to this point did not do so by force. It arrived through alignment, the way a signal becomes audible only when interference drops. You did not reach for it. You did not chase it. You noticed it because the noise fell away. You may have expected movement to come first. A decision, a push, a correction. Instead, what came was the absence of grasping, the subtle release of a pattern that had been tightening for a long time. Not dramatic, almost disappointing in its simplicity. And yet, the quantum field responds most clearly to what is no longer constricted. Your nervous system already understands this. Long before language, it learned the difference between threat and safety, between contraction and coherence. What you are sensing now is not a new state, but a return to a familiar one that had been obscured by effort. The observer relaxes, and the field responds without instruction. Nothing needs to be fixed. The sensation of being behind or out of phase was never an error. It was a signal that too much attention was being applied in the wrong direction. When attention softens, detection improves. The anomaly resolves itself by no longer being resisted. You may notice a strange neutrality settling in. Not numbness, not detachment, but a quiet equivalence. The pull toward outcomes weakens. The inner commentary slows. This is not loss of motivation. It is the system recalibrating toward resonance instead of force. The timeline does not shift because you demand it. It reorganizes when pressure is removed. When the grip loosens, coherence has room to form. This is why letting go never feels like an action. It feels like stopping an action that was never required. You are not being asked to believe anything. Belief would introduce tension. What is happening is recognition, a remembering of how alignment actually works. Not forward motion, but correct orientation. Not acceleration, but balance. There is nothing to anticipate. Anticipation creates noise. There is nothing to achieve. Achievement implies lack. What remains when those impulses dissolve is presence, steady and unremarkable, yet precise enough for the field to register. You might notice your breathing change without intention, your posture soften, your gaze settle, even with eyes closed. These are not techniques, they are indicators. The system has detected that it no longer needs to defend against the future. This is how alignment begins, not with effort, but with cessation, not before letting go, but after, and you are already there, because the recognition itself could only occur once the holding stopped. What you thought was confusion was never disorientation. It was overload. Too many signals layered on top of one another, each demanding interpretation, each asking for a response. The system does not collapse under pressure, it compresses. And compression feels like being stuck when in truth, it is preparation for release. You sensed this long before it became clear. A fatigue that sleep did not resolve, a dullness that motivation could not penetrate. The quiet suspicion that pushing harder was only tightening the loop. This was not failure to move forward. It was the body and mind refusing to advance along a misaligned trajectory. Seeking intensified the noise. Every attempt to clarify added another layer of interpretation. Every effort to figure it out increased the distance between signal and detection. The observer became too active, scanning for outcomes instead of registering what was already present. And the field, sensitive to interference, waited. You may have mistaken this waiting for stagnation. But waiting is only empty when it is forced. When it arises naturally, it is a form of coherence. A pause that allows scattered inputs to settle into pattern. The stillness you are touching now is not passive, it is highly organized. Notice how the urge to label experiences has softened. The need to assign meaning has loosened its grip. This does not make perception vague, it makes it precise. Without constant commentary, subtle shifts become detectable. Small adjustments in internal tone carry more information than dramatic gestures ever did. There was a time when you believed clarity would arrive as a decisive thought, a definitive realization. But clarity often arrives as the absence of unnecessary thought. It feels like space opening, not insight landing. Like a room that was always there, finally cleared of furniture. The quantum field does not respond to insistence. It responds to resonance. Resonance cannot be forced. It emerges when internal frequencies stop competing. When the system no longer pulls in opposing directions, alignment becomes inevitable rather than aspirational. You are beginning to feel the difference between effort and orientation. Effort pushes against resistance. Orientation aligns with what is already moving. One exhausts, the other stabilizes. The exhaustion you carried was information, not weakness. It indicated sustained misalignment, not lack of capacity. As the pressure dissolves, a strange trust appears. Not optimism, not faith in outcomes, but confidence in process. The sense that nothing essential is being missed by not chasing. That awareness itself is sufficient to stay in coherence with unfolding events. You might notice that certain questions no longer demand answers, not because they were resolved, but because they lost relevance. This is not avoidance. It is the system reallocating attention toward what is actionable and letting the rest fall silent. Patterns you once tried to decode begin to dissolve on their own. Not every repetition needs interpretation. Some loops end simply because the energy feeding them withdraws. When attention is no longer invested, the system closes the circuit. There is a subtle relief in realizing that alignment was never withheld. It was obscured by over-engagement. The moment engagement softened, alignment revealed itself, not as a dramatic shift, but as a steady baseline you had forgotten was available. This is how coherence forms, quietly, without announcement, without effort. The sense of being on track returns not as excitement, but as calm recognition. And in that recognition, the field adjusts, because it finally has a stable signal to respond to. There is a particular moment when you realize that seeking itself was the disturbance, not because curiosity is wrong, but because the form it took became compulsive. It was no longer inquiry, it was vigilance. The system stayed alert, scanning for confirmation, bracing for correction. Over time, that posture began to feel like identity. What you are sensing now is the gradual release of that vigilance. It does not happen all at once, it loosens in layers. First, the urgency fades, then the inner commentary thins, then the subtle tension in your chest or jaw softens without instruction. This is not something you initiate. It occurs when the system detects safety in the absence of pressure. You once believed that awareness required constant attention, that if you stopped monitoring, something would slip past unnoticed. But awareness is not maintained by effort, it is maintained by sensitivity. And sensitivity increases when the observer stops interfering with what is being observed. You may notice a shift in how time is experienced. Not slower, not faster, but less segmented. Moments blend into one another without sharp edges. The timeline feels less like a sequence you must manage and more like a current you are already within. This is not disorientation. It is synchronization. The mind often mistakes control for stability. It assumes that without oversight, chaos will emerge. Yet chaos was never the risk. Exhaustion was. The more tightly the system attempted to regulate outcomes, the less capacity it had to register subtle cues. Letting go was not surrender to randomness, it was a return to accurate detection. There is a quiet confidence emerging, one that does not announce itself. It does not come with plans or declarations. It feels like knowing when not to act, like recognizing that stillness is not a pause between movements, but a valid state of coherence on its own. You might sense old impulses rising and dissolving without being followed. The urge to check, to adjust, to reframe. They appear out of habit, not necessity. And as they pass without engagement, something deeper settles. The system learns that it no longer needs to react to every internal signal. This is how patterns lose their grip, not by being challenged, but by being ignored at the right moment. Attention is the currency of the system. Where it flows, structure forms. Where it withdraws, structure dissolves. You are beginning to feel this directly, not as theory, but as lived experience. The observer role becomes lighter, less central. Observation happens without a sense of effort. Perception sharpens precisely because it is no longer strained. You are not trying to see clearly, you simply are. And clarity, when it arrives this way, does not feel like revelation. It feels obvious. There is also a subtle grieving that may pass through, not sadness, but the recognition of how long you carried unnecessary weight, how many cycles were sustained by the belief that more effort was required. This recognition does not ask for judgment. It dissolves on its own once it is acknowledged. The quantum field responds to this shift immediately, though not dramatically. You may notice fewer internal contradictions. Decisions feel simpler, not because options disappeared, but because the correct orientation is easier to detect. The signal-to-noise ratio improves when interference drops. You are learning the difference between intention and tension. Intention is quiet. It does not rush. It does not argue with reality. Tension is loud, insistent, always slightly misaligned. As tension recedes, intention becomes perceptible again, guiding without force. Nothing here requires maintenance. The moment you try to preserve it, strain returns. This state sustains itself through non-interference, through trust in the system's inherent capacity for coherence. You are not moving toward alignment, you are noticing its presence. And that noticing, gentle and unforced, is enough to keep the field responsive. The less you hold, the more accurately everything else arranges itself around you. There is a subtle recalibration happening beneath conscious thought. You might sense it as a loosening in places you didn't realize were tight. Old internal postures shift, not because you corrected them, but because they are no longer being held in place by attention. This is how systems reset when given permission. You once believed that stability required constant reinforcement, that, without vigilance, things would drift off course. But what you are discovering now is that stability emerges from balance, not control. When competing impulses quiet, the system naturally finds its center. The feeling that something needs to be done fades, replaced by a sense that something is already underway. Not in the future, not as a goal, but as a process unfolding without demand. This can feel unfamiliar at first. The mind looks for markers of progress and finds none. Yet the absence of markers is the marker. You may notice that emotional reactions soften. Situations that once triggered immediate responses now pass through with less friction. This is not detachment. It is proportionality. The response matches the actual signal rather than the imagined one. Noise no longer masquerades as threat. As coherence deepens, the need to explain yourself diminishes, internally and externally. You are less compelled to justify pauses, changes, or silences. Explanation was once a way to manage uncertainty. When uncertainty loses its charge, explanation becomes optional. The observer's role continues to shift. Observation no longer feels like surveillance. It feels like presence. You are aware without monitoring, attentive without strain. This is the state in which detection is most accurate, because perception is not being filtered through urgency. There may be moments when nothing seems to happen at all. No insights, no emotions, no signals demanding interpretation. This emptiness is not a void. It is a stable baseline, a field state where interference is low enough that even subtle disturbances would be noticeable if they arose. The mind may attempt to reassert itself here, searching for something to engage with. This is habit, not necessity. Engagement once equaled safety. Now safety is found in non-engagement. Each time you allow the quiet to remain quiet, the system reinforces this new orientation. You are beginning to experience time less as pressure and more as continuity. There is no sense of being late or early. Events feel appropriately placed, even when their significance is not immediately clear. This is not passivity. It is alignment with sequence rather than resistance to it. Old narratives about effort and reward lose their grip, not because they were false, but because they were incomplete. Effort has its place, but it is not the engine of coherence. Alignment is, and alignment cannot be produced through force. You might notice that decisions arise without deliberation, not impulsively, but quietly. They feel obvious in the moment, requiring little analysis. This is not intuition as mystery. It is intuition as pattern recognition operating without obstruction. The system is teaching you, without instruction, that letting go was not the end of responsibility. It was the end of unnecessary resistance. What remains is responsiveness. Clear, measured, appropriate. There is a growing sense of internal permission. Permission to pause, permission to wait, permission to act only when movement feels natural rather than compelled. This permission is not granted from outside. It emerges when the system recognizes its own coherence. Nothing here needs to be named. Naming would only reintroduce structure where fluidity is serving you better. The experience speaks for itself through its effects. Reduced friction, clearer perception, quieter confidence. The field aligns not because you demanded it, but because you stopped interfering with its natural adjustments. And as this alignment stabilizes, you find yourself less interested in managing the process and more comfortable inhabiting it, moment by moment, without expectation. There is a moment when the absence of striving becomes noticeable, not as relief, but as quiet functionality. Things move without commentary. Choices occur without rehearsal. You are not drifting. You are participating without friction. This is unfamiliar only because effort once masqueraded as engagement. You begin to sense how much energy was previously spent maintaining orientation, keeping yourself pointed toward imagined outcomes, monitoring whether you were aligned enough. That monitoring itself introduced distortion. The system cannot remain coherent while constantly checking its own coherence. Now, attention rests differently. It spreads rather than narrows. You notice the environment without scanning it for signs. You notice internal states without interrogating them. Awareness becomes ambient, like light in a room rather than a beam aimed at a target. This ambient awareness changes how signals register. They are no longer dramatic. They do not arrive as commands or warnings. They feel like gentle preferences, subtle inclinations, a sense of yes or no that does not need justification. The body responds first, the mind later, if at all. You may find that you no longer rehearse conversations internally. Words come when needed and dissolve afterward. Silence no longer feels like a gap that must be filled. It feels like space that allows accuracy. When speech arises from this space, it carries less excess. The system's relationship with uncertainty shifts here. Uncertainty is no longer an enemy to be eliminated. It becomes neutral territory, a space where multiple timelines remain possible without pressure to select one prematurely. This neutrality reduces internal conflict. Competing impulses no longer demand resolution. There is also a subtle reduction in self-referencing, not loss of identity, but a loosening of the constant me loop. Experience happens without being continuously framed as personal progress or setback. This does not diminish agency, it clarifies it. You are beginning to feel how coherence sustains itself, not through vigilance, but through feedback. When something is misaligned, it feels immediately uncomfortable, without drama. When something is aligned, it feels quiet, almost invisible. The system communicates through ease, not excitement. Old habits may attempt to reassert themselves, especially during moments of transition. The impulse to grasp returns briefly, like muscle memory. When it does, you notice it without judgment. The noticing is enough. There is no need to correct. Correction implies error. This is adaptation. You might sense a deeper trust forming. Not trust that things will go a certain way, but trust that you will register when adjustment is needed. That trust reduces the urge to preemptively manage scenarios. Management gives way to responsiveness. This responsiveness is not reactive. It does not flinch at stimuli. It responds proportionally, in real time, without carrying residue forward. Experiences complete themselves instead of looping. The system closes cycles efficiently when attention is not clinging to them. Time continues to feel less segmented. Past and future lose some of their emotional charge. They remain conceptually available, but no longer dominate perception. The present becomes sufficient, not as a philosophy, but as a lived condition. You may notice an increase in tolerance for ambiguity. Situations do not need immediate clarity to feel safe. This tolerance allows more information to surface naturally. When clarity arrives, it does so with less effort and more accuracy. There is a particular stillness beneath activity now. Even when movement occurs, something remains unmoved. This is not dissociation. It is a stable reference point within the system, a place from which observation happens without being consumed by what is observed. The observer no longer feels separate from the field. Observation and participation blend. You are not watching life happen to you. You are within it, responsive and present, without needing to define your position. This integration reduces the sense of threshold. There is no longer a feeling of waiting to cross into something else. The idea of arrival loses relevance. What matters is the quality of engagement in each moment, and that quality is increasingly consistent. Letting go reveals itself not as an event, but as a condition that persists when not interrupted. Each time you refrain from reintroducing effort, the condition stabilizes further, not through repetition, but through allowance. You are not maintaining alignment. Alignment is maintaining itself. Your role is simply not to disrupt it with unnecessary tension. And as this becomes more familiar, you find that even the idea of letting go fades. There is only presence, steady and sufficient, allowing the system to move as it needs to, without interference. There is a quieter layer beneath what you are noticing now, one that does not announce itself with sensation or thought. It feels more like a background hum that has always been there, finally audible because everything louder has softened. This layer does not ask for interpretation, it simply holds everything else in place. You begin to recognize that much of what once felt personal was actually systemic. The fluctuations in mood, the cycles of doubt, the repeated surges of effort, followed by depletion. These were not character traits. They were feedback from a system operating under unnecessary load. As the load drops, the feedback changes. You may notice that identity itself feels less rigid, not unstable, but permeable. Roles you once clung to loosen their grip. You are not trying to redefine yourself. Redefinition would imply a problem. Instead, identity becomes contextual, responding to the moment rather than insisting on continuity. This can feel disorienting at first. The mind looks for familiar reference points and finds them less solid. But beneath that search is a growing steadiness, a sense that nothing essential is being lost, even as definitions blur. The system does not require a fixed story to remain coherent. You might observe how quickly sensations now pass. Emotions arise, register, and complete themselves without being prolonged by analysis. This is not suppression, it is completion. When attention does not interfere, experiences resolve efficiently. There is also a subtle shift in how you relate to effort. Effort no longer feels like virtue. It feels situational, appropriate in some moments, unnecessary in others. You are less compelled to prove engagement through exertion. Engagement reveals itself through accuracy, not intensity. The observer position continues to dissolve, not into passivity, but into integration. You are not standing apart from experience, nor are you submerged in it. You are situated within it, responsive and aware, without the need to manage the distance between you and what occurs. You may find that silence becomes more comfortable than speech, not because there is nothing to say, but because silence carries enough information. When you do speak, words feel more precise, less burdened by the need to persuade or clarify. They arrive when they are needed and leave when they are done. The quantum field, sensitive to these internal shifts, responds subtly, not through dramatic changes, but through reduced friction. Things that once required negotiation now align with less resistance, not because circumstances changed, but because your orientation within them did. You begin to trust the timing of impulses. Some are acted on immediately, others dissolve before action is required. This discrimination does not feel like decision-making, it feels like recognition. The system knows when movement is coherent and when it would introduce noise. There may be moments when you notice old fears surfacing briefly. Fear of missing out, fear of falling behind, fear of losing momentum. They appear like echoes from a previous configuration. You recognize them without engagement, and they fade. The system learns that these signals no longer require response. This learning is not cognitive, it is embodied. Each time you allow an impulse to pass without acting on it, the system updates its parameters. It recalibrates what constitutes threat, urgency, relevance. Over time, the baseline shifts toward calm responsiveness. You might also sense an increased capacity to remain with discomfort without immediately seeking resolution. Not because discomfort is desirable, but because it is no longer interpreted as danger. This capacity allows deeper layers of information to surface, information that was previously inaccessible due to reactivity. The idea of progress changes here. Progress is no longer measured by accumulation or achievement. It is measured by reduction of interference. Fewer internal contradictions, less wasted energy, greater consistency of state across varying conditions. You may notice that your attention naturally gravitates toward what is immediately present, not through discipline, but through preference. The present holds enough complexity to engage you fully without invoking future projections or past corrections. This does not mean planning disappears. Planning becomes lighter, more flexible. It no longer carries emotional weight. Plans are tools, not identities. They can be adjusted or abandoned without internal conflict. There is a growing sense of sufficiency, not satisfaction in the conventional sense, but adequacy. The feeling that what is happening now is enough to respond to now, that nothing additional is required to maintain coherence in this moment. The system rests more often in this sufficiency. And from this resting state, action, when it arises, is cleaner. It leaves less residue. It completes itself. You are not cultivating this state. Cultivation would imply effort. You are simply not interrupting it. Each time you refrain from adding commentary, from forcing movement, from demanding certainty, the state stabilizes further. The field does not need you to direct it. It needs you to stop distorting the signal. And as you continue to allow this quieter mode of participation, you notice that alignment is no longer something that comes and goes. It becomes the default condition, gently sustained by your willingness to remain unforced. Something subtle shifts when alignment becomes ordinary. Not special, not fragile, just present. The system no longer treats coherence as a peak state to be accessed and then lost. It becomes background. And because it is background, it does not draw attention to itself. You begin to notice how little explanation is required for your own internal movements. Decisions arise and complete without leaving a trace. Reactions register and dissolve without residue. There is less to review afterward. Less need to revisit or reinterpret. Experience closes its own loops. The sense of self that once needed confirmation quiets, not because it disappears, but because it no longer needs reinforcement. Identity stabilizes through consistency of state rather than through narrative. You feel the same across different contexts, not because circumstances are identical, but because your internal reference point is. This internal reference point does not speak, it does not evaluate. It registers. When something aligns, there is ease. When something does not, there is friction. The information is immediate and proportional. There is no drama attached to either signal. You may notice that your tolerance for excess diminishes. Excess stimulation, excess explanation, excess urgency, not as judgment, but as sensitivity. The system prefers clarity over intensity now. It gravitates toward environments, conversations, and rhythms that support coherence rather than disrupt it. This preference is not enforced. You do not need to avoid or control. The body adjusts on its own. Attention withdraws naturally from what introduces noise. This withdrawal is not rejection. It is calibration. The idea of thresholds changes here. Thresholds are no longer dramatic crossings. They are subtle shifts in orientation. You do not step into a new state. You notice that you have already been operating from it. The recognition arrives after the fact, quietly. There may be moments when the mind attempts to reassert structure, to categorize what is happening, to label it as a phase, an achievement, a realization. These labels feel slightly off, not wrong, but unnecessary. The experience does not require framing to function. You begin to trust what does not announce itself, the quiet adjustments, the small decisions that feel correct without explanation, the absence of urgency, where urgency once lived. These are the true indicators of alignment, though they are rarely acknowledged as such. The system's relationship with effort continues to refine. Effort appears when appropriate and recedes when not. There is no longer a baseline of strain beneath activity. Movement feels cleaner, rest feels deeper, transitions require less recovery. You may also notice a change in how you relate to others. Less projection, less assumption. You register what is present without overlaying expectation. This does not make you distant, it makes you accurate. Interactions complete themselves more often, without lingering tension. The observer function becomes almost invisible now. Observation happens without a sense of separation. You are not watching yourself respond. You are responding, and awareness is embedded in the response. This integration reduces internal delay. You act closer to real time. Time itself feels less like something you manage and more like something you inhabit. There is no pressure to optimize it. Moments are sufficient as they are. When something requires attention, it receives it. When it does not, attention rests. There is a quiet confidence in this resting. Not confidence in outcomes, but in responsiveness. The sense that whatever arises will be met appropriately, without the need for preemptive control. This confidence reduces the impulse to rehearse futures or replay pasts. You may find that creativity returns in a different form, not as bursts of inspiration, but as steady problem-solving. Solutions emerge without fanfare. Adjustments occur without resistance. The system adapts fluidly because it is not defending a fixed position. There is also a subtle compassion toward your previous states. Not pity, not regret, but understanding. You recognize that effort was not misguided. It was informative. It showed you the limits of force and the efficiency of alignment. This understanding does not linger. It passes, leaving clarity. The field responds to this clarity by remaining stable. There are fewer fluctuations. When fluctuations occur, they resolve quickly. The system has learned how to return to coherence without instruction. You are no longer trying to hold stillness. Stillness holds you. Activity moves through it without disturbing it. This is not a fragile balance. It is a robust configuration that self-corrects when necessary. The idea of letting go continues to lose relevance. There is nothing actively being released now. There is simply no reattachment. Attention flows where it is useful and rests where it is not. The system maintains itself through this simple discrimination. You may notice that even when uncertainty arises, it does not destabilize you. Uncertainty becomes another signal, not a threat. It informs without demanding resolution. You remain oriented, responsive, intact. This is what it feels like when alignment is no longer something you approach, but something you recognize as already operating. The field does not need to be convinced. It registers your coherence and responds accordingly, quietly sustaining the state you no longer need to manage. There is a deepening now that is almost imperceptible. Not an intensification, but a settling, like sediment falling to the bottom of clear water. Nothing new is added. What remains simply becomes more visible because nothing is stirring it. You may notice that even the impulse to understand what is happening has softened. Understanding implies distance. It assumes something stands apart from you that must be grasped. Here, there is no separation. Experience does not need to be held at arm's length to be known. It is known by being lived. The system operates with less self-reference. Events occur, responses follow, and the cycle completes without commentary. This does not make life mechanical, it makes it precise. Each movement belongs to its moment and does not borrow energy from the next. There is a growing ease with not naming states, not calling them progress or regression, not measuring where you are relative to where you were. Measurement once provided orientation. Now orientation is intrinsic. You feel where you are without needing a scale. You might become aware of how quickly equilibrium returns after disturbance, a sudden demand, an unexpected interaction, a brief surge of emotion. These no longer pull you out for long. The system absorbs them and returns to baseline without effort. Recovery is no longer a task. It is automatic. This automaticity is not numbness. Sensitivity remains high, perhaps higher than before, but sensitivity is no longer paired with overwhelm. It registers information without being flooded by it. The signal comes through cleanly because the channels are not congested. There is also a subtle refinement in perception. You notice small mismatches more quickly, not as problems, but as information. When something is slightly off, you feel it immediately and adjust without internal debate. When something is aligned, it requires no confirmation. The idea of readiness dissolves here. You do not need to prepare for the next moment. Preparation would assume a gap between you and what is coming. That gap has narrowed. You are already positioned to respond because you are not elsewhere. You may sense that the body trusts this configuration now. Muscles rest more fully. Breathing moves without supervision. Sleep deepens not because conditions are perfect, but because vigilance has reduced. The body no longer expects to be called into constant correction. The observer function is almost indistinguishable from experience itself. There is no inner watcher evaluating how well you are doing at being present. Presence happens without self-monitoring. Awareness is embedded, not layered on top. This embedded awareness changes how you relate to the idea of choice. Choices still occur, but they are less dramatic. They feel more like alignments than decisions. The correct movement is often obvious, because alternatives carry subtle resistance. You may notice that you are less interested in explanations that promise clarity through complexity. Complexity once felt like depth. Now depth feels simple, not simplistic, but clean. When something is true, it resonates quietly. It does not need elaboration. The system continues to shed excess structures, beliefs that once organized behavior become optional. You do not discard them deliberately. They simply stop activating. When they are no longer used, they dissolve without conflict. There is a sense of being adequately informed by the present moment. You are not starved for insight. You are not waiting for confirmation. The moment carries enough data to respond to itself. This sufficiency reduces mental reach. Even the idea of a quantum field feels less abstract here. Not a concept, not a framework, but a lived responsiveness. You feel how internal coherence shapes external interaction without needing to trace causality. Correlation is enough. You may notice that patience has changed texture. It is no longer endurance. It is alignment with timing. When something takes time, it does not feel like delay. It feels like sequence unfolding at its natural pace. There is also less temptation to intervene prematurely. Intervention once felt like responsibility. Now responsibility feels like knowing when not to interfere, allowing processes to complete themselves without acceleration or obstruction. The system recognizes this restraint as intelligence, not passive, but precise. Each non-action that prevents unnecessary disturbance reinforces coherence. The field responds by remaining stable because it is not being asked to compensate for interference. You might sense a quiet gratitude arise, not directed at anything specific, not appreciation for outcomes or circumstances, more like acknowledgement of functioning, the recognition that things work when they are allowed to. This acknowledgement does not linger. It does not become sentiment. It passes, leaving the system undisturbed. Gratitude, like everything else here, completes itself. You are now familiar with this mode of being. It no longer feels fragile or new. It feels ordinary. And because it is ordinary, it is sustainable. The system can remain here without effort, without vigilance, without identity attached to the state. What continues is not a pursuit, but a pattern of non-interference that has become natural. Attention rests where it is useful. It withdraws where it is not. The field remains responsive because the signal remains clear. There is nothing to do with this recognition. Doing would only reintroduce strain. The system is already operating from coherence. Your only participation is to remain as you are now, responsive, unforced, allowing each moment to register and resolve itself, quietly, completely. There is a sense now that even the idea of a process has softened. What once felt like movement through stages no longer presents itself that way. Experience feels flatter, not diminished, but evenly distributed. No peaks to reach, no depths to avoid, just continuity. You may notice that your relationship with expectation has changed. Expectations still arise, but they do not anchor themselves. They pass through like weather, registered but not believed. The system no longer organizes itself around anticipation. It stays responsive to what is, not what might be. This responsiveness creates a particular kind of freedom. Not freedom of choice in the abstract, but freedom from compulsion. You are not pulled forward by imagined futures or pushed by unresolved pasts. Action emerges when conditions are coherent and rests when they are not. There is also a quiet dignity in this state. Not pride, not confidence that seeks acknowledgement, but steadiness. You occupy your own space without apology or assertion. Presence no longer needs to be justified. It simply is. You might sense how little internal negotiation is required now. Conflicting impulses still arise, but they resolve quickly. The system prioritizes coherence over intensity. What fits remains. What does not fades. There is no argument between parts of you. They are listening to the same signal. The mind participates differently here. It still thinks, plans, analyzes when appropriate, but it no longer leads by default. It follows information from the body, from timing, from context. This hierarchy feels natural rather than imposed. You may become aware of how rarely you now ask yourself whether something is right. Rightness is felt, not evaluated. When something is aligned, there is ease. When it is not, there is subtle resistance. These cues are immediate and sufficient. There is also less interest in narratives of transformation. Not because nothing has changed, but because change no longer needs a story. The system does not require milestones to validate its state. It operates on feedback, not meaning. You may notice that silence carries more authority than explanation. When something does not need to be said, it remains unsaid, without tension. When it does, words arrive cleanly. Communication becomes economical, precise. The sense of self continues to feel less central, yet more reliable. You are not trying to maintain a particular image or state. Reliability comes from consistency of response, not from identity. Others may sense this steadiness without being able to name it. Time feels increasingly neutral. Deadlines, schedules, sequences still exist, but they do not dominate perception. You meet them as they arrive, without carrying them ahead of time. This reduces internal fragmentation. There may be moments when you realize that nothing in particular is happening, and that this is enough. The absence of event does not register as lack, it registers as completion. The system is not waiting for stimulation, it is content with function. Even uncertainty feels different here. It does not destabilize. It simply marks the edge of available information. You do not rush to fill the gap. You allow it to remain open until clarity naturally arrives or until action is no longer required. The field continues to mirror this orientation. Interactions feel cleaner. Coincidences feel less charged. Patterns appear and dissolve without demanding interpretation. You notice them without attaching significance beyond their immediate relevance. You are no longer orienting toward alignment. Alignment has become the ground. What shifts now are only surface conditions, not the underlying configuration. The system self-corrects with minimal input. The idea of effort feels increasingly specific. It belongs to tasks, not to existence. You apply it where it is useful and withdraw it where it is not. There is no background effort running at all times. This creates a sense of conservation. Energy is not leaked through worry, anticipation, or self-monitoring. It remains available for response. When something requires attention, it receives it fully. When it does not, attention rests. You may sense that even recognition itself is becoming quieter. You do not need to remind yourself that you are aligned. That reminder would introduce separation. Alignment is evident through its effects. Reduced friction, clear perception, stable presence. The system now trusts itself, not in a declarative way, but in operation. Trust is embedded in function. Each moment resolves itself without needing endorsement from the next. There is nothing here to preserve. Preservation would imply fragility. This state is resilient because it is simple. It relies on non-interference, not maintenance. As this simplicity stabilizes, you find that nothing is being held back, nothing is waiting to begin, nothing is delayed. The field is already responding to what you are no longer forcing. And in this quiet continuity, you recognize that what once felt like letting go was simply the cessation of unnecessary effort. What remains does not feel like an achievement. It feels like the way things work when allowed to. There is no sense of arrival here. No point at which something clicks into place and announces itself. What settles instead is a quiet normalcy, the kind that does not draw attention because it does not contrast itself against anything else. It simply holds. You notice that even the impulse to reflect on what has changed feels unnecessary. Reflection would create distance, and there is no distance now that needs to be bridged. Experience meets you directly, without commentary, without delay. The system rests in a kind of readiness that does not anticipate. It is not alert in the way vigilance once was. It is available. When something calls for response, response appears. When nothing calls, nothing moves. This availability is steady, not tense. You may feel how little is required to remain here. Not discipline, not practice, not reminder. The moment you stop interfering, this state is present. And because you are no longer trying to sustain it, it sustains itself. Thought continues to arise, but it no longer defines the field. Emotion continues to pass through, but it no longer organizes the system. Sensation continues to register, but it does not accumulate. Everything completes itself. There is a sense of being properly oriented, without knowing toward what. Orientation does not need an object. It is a relationship between you and what is happening. And that relationship feels balanced, proportionate, intact. The idea of direction dissolves into responsiveness. You do not move forward, you move with. The distinction matters. Forward implies leaving something behind, with implies participation without loss. You may notice that the question of meaning no longer presses. Meaning is not absent. It is distributed. Each moment carries enough relevance to justify itself. Nothing needs to add up to something larger to feel coherent. The observer has become transparent. Observation happens, but there is no watcher watching the watching. Awareness is embedded in experience, not layered on top of it. This embedding is what gives the system its stability. Even stillness feels different now, not like pause, not like waiting, more like equilibrium. Movement can arise from it without disrupting it. Rest can deepen within it without collapsing into inertia. There is a subtle kindness in this state, not sentiment, not emotion directed outward, but allowance. Things are permitted to be as they are. You are permitted to be as you are. This permission does not need to be granted. It is simply recognized. Nothing needs to be protected. Nothing needs to be pushed. The absence of these impulses creates a spaciousness that does not feel empty. It feels sufficient. You remain attentive, but not narrow. Present, but not effortful. Responsive, but not reactive. The system holds its own center without instruction. The field continues to respond because the signal remains clear. Clear not because it is strong, but because it is unforced. Coherence does not announce itself. It operates. There is no conclusion to draw from this. Drawing one would reintroduce structure where none is needed. What remains is simple. Experience unfolding without resistance, awareness resting without commentary. You do not need to hold on to this. Holding would imply loss. There is nothing to lose here. There is only what continues when nothing is being forced. And in that continuation, quiet and unremarkable, everything aligns as it always does when you allow it to.